entire world is created in a way that you're not just a fan of the band, you're a member of their club, you're in their gang.
It's about the image and the attitude and the show that people get, and that's what keeps them coming back.
Their live shows have been consistently brilliant throughout the decades, and that's given them a loyal, large fan base.
There was Kiss everything. The music became less important than the live spectacle, and most importantly, the image.
They have probably the most recognisable and iconic outfits in the history of rock and roll music.
They will never age. They will always be that iconic look.
Gene Simmons, Chaim Witz, was born in Haifa, which is a port in Israel, very much the Ellis Island of Israel, where a lot of Holocaust refugees came just after the war. And included in those was Gene Simmons and his mother, Florence, and his father, who was a carpenter. And they settled in Israel for a while because they came from Hungary, where they'd survived the Holocaust. And then eventually, young Chaim and his mum moved to Jackson Heights in New York.
He had a very, very tragic background, and he often says that's one of the reasons why he loves America so much, because America, gave him safe passage and got involved in the war, and for those reasons he's, extremely patriotic.
He changed his name to Eugene Klein, actually, when they were in the States. And it's a common theme, actually, in Kiss, sort of trying to leave their roots behind, in a sense. He was practicing guitar as well for hours and hours, and he was also an assistant at Vogue magazine for a little bit, bizarrely enough.
Paul Stanley, who Stanley Ison, to give him his birth name, he was also the child of Holocaust survivors too. They moved to New York, to a much more Jewish area, to a place called Kew Gardens.
Paul Stanley was born in Manhattan, like Gene Simmons, brought up in a close Jewish family. Again, with some of that kind of trauma in their history. His mother's family had fled Nazi Germany.
Again, a kind of troubled childhood. He had a damaged ear. The ear itself was deformed. It wasn't just, damaged hearing, and he got bullied quite heavily for it.
He actually changed his name from its original Jewish one to Paul Stanley. He grew up in a house where his parents listened to light opera and lots of classical, and he was very much influenced by Beethoven as well. He saw the Rolling Stones and the Beatles perform on TV in the States, and that really influenced him from a performance aspect.
Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley joined forces in 1970, forming the band Rainbow. Realizing there was already a group by the same name, they quickly began performing as Wicked Lester.
Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley ended up in a band together after both being in various other kind of musical collaborations before. They ended up in this band which became Wicked Lester, and they got their big break when they were going to record one record with Epic.
She walks by moonlight.
They were signed very, very early to a major label, but just at the point where everything seemed to be going right, everything went wrong. Wicked Lester played just 2 concerts in their illustrious career, and after the second one, all their equipment was stolen. But no matter, because they still had a major label deal.
Epic didn't like the music or the image. Now that's kind of bad, because that's pretty much all you've got.
As soon as Epic Records heard their album, then they dropped them.
It was kind of a bit of a dead end, really, as the start of their musical career. And at that point, the two of them thought, we need to do something different, let's start a new band, let's try and do something with a different kind of musical direction and focus.
Simmons and Stanley recognized the need to find a simpler, more aggressive style of rock and roll, and began searching for a new drummer and guitarist.
Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley recruited Peter Criss. He applied after answering an advertisement in the Eastern edition of Rolling Stone. Now, the popular myth is that this advert required a drummer who, quote, will do anything to become famous. And obviously that's not strictly true. But when Peter Criss answered the advertisement, Gene Simmons said to him, will you do anything to be famous? And Peter Criss said yes.
Similarly, Ace Frehley saw an advert looking for a guitarist, and he went and auditioned. And I think the story is that initially they weren't too keen on his look. They thought it was a bit odd because he was wearing different coloured sneakers when he turned up for the audition. But they liked his guitar playing, so he joined the band.
And so Wicked Lester became Kiss, the band we all know today.
With the 4 band members now complete and a new musical direction in place, Kiss were officially formed. However, their rebranding would prove somewhat controversial.
They were driving around New York one day, and Peter Criss happened to mention that he'd been in a band called Lips. And this lit a little light bulb in Paul Stanley's head, and he said, haha, how about Kiss? And Kiss it was. Now, every good band needs a really good logo.
It was Ace Frehley that came up with the sort of iconic band lettering and the logo. Now, this was kind of controversial because the 2 S's look like the SS symbol from, obviously, Nazi Germany. I mean, it's almost identical in terms of those runic symbols. That symbol is actually banned as well in Germany, or certainly was banned at the time.
You know, for 2 Jewish people, one whose family perished in the Holocaust is highly unlikely. But they did concede and they changed the design.
The similarity was, frankly, striking. And so, in Germany and Israel and several other countries, Kiss's logo is very different to the one that we see in the United States and the United Kingdom.
Kiss are widely recognised today for their heavy use of makeup, but this wasn't something the band started out wearing when they began playing live in 1973.
So when Kiss first started gigging, they weren't covered in makeup, they weren't kind of putting this stage persona on, but slowly it kind of came into what they did on stage, and they created these cartoon characters for each of them.
Gene Simmons, I think, is meant to look like a demon. Peter Criss was the Catman. Ace Frehley was a spaceman, and Paul Stanley had a big star on his face. And so they had these personas, and I think this was the era of glam rock. It was all about looking androgynous, but Kiss were these working class guys, also over 6 foot tall, and, you know, by their own admission, they looked like a bunch of sort of, you know, builders in drag when they tried to look androgynous, so it didn't really work.
They played a gig at a place called The Daisy in Amityville, and that was the point that they started to evolve, because before that, they didn't really wear any makeup on stage.
The makeup was very unusual. Alice Cooper had done it, and he'd had success with it, and it made them more theatrical, it made them special.
By the end of 1973, Kiss became the first act signed to new label Casablanca Records, and had their official industry premiere at the Academy of Music, an event that wouldn't quite go to plan.
New Year's Eve, 1973, Kiss was supporting Blue Oyster Cult in New York. And during the song Firehouse, Gene Simmons had invented this trick where he blew fire from his mouth. This involved going off stage and filling his mouth with kerosene and then lighting it up and blowing the flame on stage.
Kiss very quickly realised that what they lacked in sort of musical dynamism, they could certainly make up for in showboating and extravaganzas, and they started playing with fire. And it didn't take long for him to set his hair alight.
Which of course was covered in hairspray and highly flammable, and so had this like incredible fireball moment, the first of many. I mean, this happened time and time again when he was doing his fire breathing routine.
Gene Simmons effectively exploded on stage. The roadies had to rush on stage and towel him down.
early on with Kiss, they weren't selling that many records, but their live shows were becoming like this phenomenon. Like, they were always sold out, and people were talking about them because they were so theatrical, because of course they had all the makeup and the costumes, they had like moving drum risers, they had Gene Simmons doing fire breathing. It was a really epic show.
Ace Frehley's guitar would burst into flames. Peter Criss had a platform and a sort of drum kit that raised up and elevated. So the whole thing was much more like a circus show than it was a rock concert.
Yeah, people loved it. I mean, it's a spectacle. It was a kind of, rock and roll circus.
Kiss had already earned a significant reputation for their live performances. However, their first two albums, Kiss and Hotter Than Hell, did not have strong sales. In 1975, they released their third studio album, Dressed to Kill.
You show us everything you've got. You keep on dancing and the rhythm gets hot. You drive us wild, we'll drive you crazy.
Kiss's third LP, Dressed to Kill, hot on the heels of two pretty unsuccessful albums, was notable for two things. One, it was very short. Secondly, it gave us Kiss's first great classic, Rock and Roll All Night.
One of the most iconic and well-known Kiss songs. And it's that moment, I think, when you listen to it, you can hear that they're starting to embrace a slightly more pop rock sound, and kind of that realization of how they could be more commercially successful and how they could break into the mainstream more.
That's quite a lot. And you drive us wild, we'll drive you crazy.
Despite the success of Rock and Roll All Night, album sales were still not particularly high. This would change with the release of a double live album.
She's a dancer, a romancer. I'm a Capricorn and she's a Cancer. She saw my picture in a music magazine. When she
Kiss had such a strong live reputation and such a poor recorded reputation that Casablanca, in their wisdom, decided the solution to this was to put out a live album, thus capturing the essence of Kiss.
It was both theirs and Casablanca, the label's first ever top 10 charting album. Now, it went gold. This obviously was a big breakthrough for the band, but it essentially saved Casablanca.
Incredibly, it was a double live album that saved not only Kiss's career at that point, but also their record label, which was on the verge of going bankrupt. And you just wouldn't think that would happen, but because they were such an incredible live phenomenon, it was that really translated into record sales.
She looks good, she looks hotter than hell. All dressed in satin silver. I looked at her and it was just too clear. I had to get on the case.
The album started to get the message out that this was a kind of over-the-top band, where it's a thing to do to go and see Kiss on a Friday night, and it would be, you'd have a great extravaganza and they'd be acting like rock stars and everything would be over the top.
Now, since then, Peter Criss has said that the only actual live thing on it was his drums, and that everything else was adapted, shall we say, in the studio, including guitar overdubs and audience noise. But what's wrong with that? It sounded like a great record, and you want to make the best record that you can, and they did, and it was their breakthrough.
Following the success of Alive, Kiss produced their most ambitious album to date with the 1976 release of Destroyer.
the success of Alive, I think what Kiss then tried to do with Destroyer was to bring that more theatrical live element to a studio recording without being another live album. So it was a much more theatrical album. There was children screaming on it, orchestral uses and that kind of thing, just making it a bit more of an over-the-top production.
You say you feel so empty.
It gave them another breakthrough song, this time Beth, which was a very out-of-character ballad sung by Peter Criss, which the label had put on the B-side to make sure that American radio stations played the much heavier Detroit Rock City. But they didn't. They flipped it over, played a ballad, and by fluke, Kiss got themselves a hit and a signature song.
What can I do? Beth, what can I do?
It had orchestral music in it and actually featured an orchestra, and it showed the grandiose scale that they were thinking on.
If you look at the album cover, it's got them in their finery, sort of stomping over a scorched earth with flames coming up and all the rest of it.
Before then, they'd always been in makeup, of course, but they'd been photographs. This time they were cartoons. And Destroyer was the album after they'd had success. So for once, finally, it was quite a lavish production.
Beth, I know you're lonely.
Suddenly you have Kiss, who are dressing up like comic book superheroes and acting like them as well, and not taking themselves seriously at all, seeing the whole thing as a kind of, basically a brand and a product. And Destroyer was the one that went global. It basically turned them into a multinational brand.
Come on, Margaret, I've always wanted to meet Kiss. Hi, fellas. Well, just what I've always wanted. 4 kisses on the first date.
Kiss continued to promote the Destroyer album and reach an even wider audience on the Paul Lynde Halloween special.
Does your mother know what you're doing? Margaret, you haven't introduced me to your friends.
Oh, forgive me. This is Ace, this is Jean, this is Peter, and this is Paul.
Oh, I love a good religious group.
This was a perfect example of them extending the comic book thing, because the Wicked Witch of the West from Wizard of Oz, she introduced them, and they came on and sort of acted as these terrible characters, terrible rock and roll deviants, which I don't think they really were.
And your makeup is something else. How long does it take you to put it on?
We don't wear makeup.
It was that moment where they could really get into the living rooms of that generation of people and put themselves out there. In terms of PR, it was huge for them.
It's so sad living at home, far from the city, and the midnight road gets so
They lip-synced 3 of their songs. Now, this gave them a huge amount of mainstream exposure because it was a very sort of big mainstream show.
I'm the king of the nighttime world, and you're my headlight queen. I'm the king of the nighttime world.
What it showed was Kiss, in fact, despite their ferocious cartoon image, were very cuddly. They were not threatening, and that changed their career.
I'm the king. I'm the king. I'm the king. I'm the king.
By 1977, Kiss had become one of the biggest-selling rock bands in the world and broke concert attendance records.
I know what you got. Let's get together. We can get hot.
1976 and 77 were really important years for Kiss. They released Love Gun and Rock and Roll Over, and these were their 2 biggest albums at that point. They were massive. This was the moment that they became one of the biggest bands in America, at the height of their success, and making some serious money for the first time.
You pull the trigger. Love, love, love.
This was backed up, as ever with Kiss, by their live shows. And because now they had bigger budgets, because they could afford better quality makeup, because they could do daft things like their fire breathing and all the nonsense surrounding them, then they became the biggest band in America.
Baby.
In a Gallup poll, they were noted to be the most popular band in the world. And I think most interestingly, and something that certainly I would never expect, is they broke a record set by the Beatles. So this was for consecutive sold-out performances in Japan. The Beatles managed 4, but Kiss managed 5.
Shock me! Put on your black leather.
As Kiss's international popularity spread, it wasn't long before their comic book personas would be featured for real in one of the world's biggest comic brands.
Kiss had a relationship with Marvel at first when they appeared in a Marvel comic called Howard the Duck. Now, because of Kiss's theatrical, cartoonish image, it very much lent itself to comic books and graphic novels. They ended up actually starring in their own comics released by Marvel.
It was that moment where their comic book characters could suddenly be imagined in the world that they were originally designed for. It was like a perfect hookup. So they started appearing in various Kiss-affiliated comics.
And this was kind of the genesis of the Kiss merchandise empire, which is thought to have made the band somewhere in the region of $100 million.
Shock me!
There were Kiss dolls, Kiss makeup kits. There was a Kiss pinball, which you could go to the arcade and play. There was Kiss everything. And, you know, the music became less important than the live spectacle, and most importantly, the image.
In 1978, Kiss were unquestionably the biggest rock band in America, and their manager had the remarkable strategy of releasing 4 solo albums on the same day.
It sounds like a really strange idea, but it actually worked. He got each member of the band to release a solo album at exactly the same time. All completely different, all kind of showing off their individual kind of influences and musical tastes.
You'd think that would be flooding the market, four big albums all at once, but they did really, really well. They all got into the US top 10.
It was a brilliant strategy, and they sold reasonably well. Ace Frehley's was the most successful. Peter Criss's was the one least like Kiss. But as a marketing strategy, it was brilliant. And then it was suggested to them that they do a film.
This is what you did when you became really big. The Beatles made films, you know, the Stones did films, now Kiss had their own film. But unfortunately, they didn't like the film.
Sam, start shooting now. And get each of their faces from every possible angle.
In their heads, this was going to be them portrayed as superheroes. Actually, what happened is it was more slapstick, cartoony, and in later interviews, they expressed regret about ever having done it. But it was one of the most watched TV movies of the year.
They thought they wanted to be superheroes, these kind of macho characters. But by their own admission, they kind of came across more as 4 bumbling idiots, or clowns, as the word they used, I think.
Is there something wrong, Demon?
I'm not sure.
It involved a mad scientist who was attempting to take over some amusement park. Eventually, a robot version of Kiss plays a concert, and that's followed by the real Kiss coming in to save the day. The miracle, of course, is how it never troubled the Oscar nomination committee.
Are you ready to rock and roll?
Despite the huge success Kiss were enjoying at the end of the 70s, relationships within the band weren't as strong as their popularity would suggest.
Around the time of Dynasty was when Peter Criss became an issue. He says, looking back, that he kind of OD'd on fame. There was a lot of drink and drugs involved, and he ended up having this serious car accident, which meant that his damage to his ribs, his fingers, meant he couldn't play on Dynasty.
It meant that although he recovered, His dexterity and his drumming capabilities were very much impaired. So the rest of Kiss decided that he wouldn't really take part in the recording sessions of the album, and they got the very respected Anton Fig to fill in for him.
I think the car accident was the catalyst. Kiss was a very fractious band. They weren't getting on particularly well. Ace Frehley and Peter Criss seemed to be the two that were increasingly getting edged out as Gene Simmons really took the lead.
We're gonna make it all come true.
Whether he was sacked or whether he was resigned is still a matter of dispute. But he'd been getting very frustrated with his lack of input into the group, and they'd been getting very frustrated with him. And Paul Stanley said he was becoming impossible to work with. So there was a parting of the ways.
In the early 80s, Kiss's popularity was definitely on the slide. They released an album called Music from the Elder, which allegedly was going to be sort of a hard rock album going back to their roots. What it actually was a concept album featuring stuff like medieval horns.
Apparently a soundtrack to a film which they never made, and it was pretty confusing. I think at that time even die-hard Kiss fans would have found it very difficult to kind of stay on board with them.
It's not what people wanted from Kiss. They'd established themselves with their audience by being a certain type of band. And when they tried to very clumsily expand their horizons, it didn't work.
Ace was pretty annoyed about Peter Criss leaving the band, obviously another one of the original members, and about the band's musical direction. He felt it was really leaving behind their roots. Also, on top of that, I think he struggled with the idea that Simmons and Stanley would kind of sort of outvote him on band decisions, and he really struggled to have a voice.
Relations had really deteriorated in the band. So Ace Frehley left, but under a cloud, and there were lawsuits. Peter Criss left. So now it's just Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons leading this band, which they continue to call Kiss. But, you know, if you think about it, the other two weren't just hired hands, they were there from the very beginning.
Vinnie Vincent replaced Ace Frehley in the band as lead guitarist. However, he also clashed with Simmons and with Stanley, and kept being booted out and then brought back in and booted out.
I think they had like 4 guitarists in 3 years at one point, and all of this kind of really affected, I think, the band's fan base, their kind of popularity, and also they just really struggled with their identity at that time as well.
In September 1983, they'd had a decade in makeup. They decided to promote their new album that they would announce on MTV that they were no longer wearing makeup and people could finally see what they looked like. And yes, it did give them a very short boost for what appeared to be a flagging career.
Vinnie Vincent, lead guitarist and co-writer of many of the songs on the current Kiss album. Eric Carr, drummer, has been with the band since 1979. And Kiss is, by the way, the very first band that Eric has ever been with. Paul Stanley, rhythm guitarist and lead vocalist. Paul is a co-founder of the group. Gene Simmons, bass, also co-founder of Kiss. He is the fire-breathing, blood-spitting monster of Kiss. Welcome, you guys. This is amazing. Whoa.
It was a great way to just kind of make people look again. Look, you know, here we are without our masks on. And that was successful for them, and the album Animalize did see a bit of a return of fortune for them.
It sold over 2 million copies. And the removal of the hair and makeup, that actually, ironically, if people know you in public as having that look, when you remove that, that in itself is another costume. And it was actually quite a good publicity ploy to get some commercial attention.
They got to the point where they would embraced 80s almost kind of mall rock, you know, that kind of corporate rock culture which was emerging. And they had this song Crazy Nights, which was just absolutely everywhere.
Crazy Night was one of Kiss's most successful international albums, and the single earned the band its highest UK chart position.
There's no denying when I look in your eyes. Girl, I'm out of my head over you.
After the last decade's success, Kiss were now regarded as one of the greatest rock bands around. They ended the 80s with the albums Smashes, Thrashes and Hits, as well as Hot in the Shade, featuring the hit ballad Forever. Sadly, tragedy was to strike in 1991 with the death of drummer Eric Carr.
The 90s weren't great for Kiss. The drummer Eric Carr died of a brain hemorrhage, and Gene Simmons was appearing to lose interest in Kiss. He got involved in managing bands, he got involved in acting. It was almost anything to stop being in Kiss while still actually being in Kiss. And it got to the stage in the 90s where they would tour live, always a popular attraction, but at one point they were touring their own fan club conventions.
The band saw a way of really revitalising their brand. They brought out this book, Kiss Story, and they even started Kiss conventions where fans could get together, sell merch, swap Kiss stories and meet the band members. It became its own phenomenon.
They were trading on nostalgia. They did seem out of time, but they still had this large, fanatically loyal fan base.
In America, it seems that if you hang around long enough, you have to go through these fallow periods, and then people can love you again. And I think that's what happened with Kiss. All of a sudden, there's a whole generation who'd grown up with them, and now their kids were coming along to the concerts. And it was just a thing to do. It's almost part of American culture.
In 1996, Kiss would once again return to the world's attention at the 38th Annual Grammy Awards, appearing as the original lineup.
They were introduced by Tupac Shakur, of all people.
This was the moment they became cool again. So they'd been cool, they'd then gone uncool, and then when Tupac introduces you on stage at the Grammys, you're cool again. So they'd completed the circle. They were back on stage, the original lineup, the original old outfits, and the makeup was back.
And you've got to remember that they've hated each other for a long time, and there they all are, being celebrated as a kind of legendary band, which certainly Kiss were never critical favourites. And it's almost like they'd come full circle, and so they're being honoured at the Grammys by Tupac Shakur, of all people.
Kiss were back at the top of their game and became the highest-rating concert act of 1996, touring for over a year and playing 192 shows. They followed this up with the album Psycho Circus, which earned favourable reviews and prompted another successful tour. They also featured in the 1999 film Detroit Rock City.
Detroit Rock City was filmed in Canada. It had a budget of $34 million and it made approximately $5 million at the box office. So it wasn't particularly successful.
A film about a Kiss cover band who were desperate to get tickets to see their idols play in Detroit and would do anything for the tickets. The band appeared in the film, they played in it, and of course their song inspired the title of the entire thing.
It's just a real high school movie. It's about 4 boys who form a Kiss covers band, and basically they want to go and see the concert, and their parents don't approve. It's very similar to, at the time, there's a few films like that. There was a film called Dazed and Confused, and I think it was a nostalgia for the innocence of 70s rock and roll. Just as in the 70s, there's a whole nostalgia for the innocence of 50s rock and roll with Happy Days and all the rest of it, American Graffiti. So it's just something that happens. People are looking back on their youth and, having a bit of nostalgia. And it's a fun film.
Despite the huge success, the fragmented nature of the band continued over the following years, and the original lineup did not last long. Chris and Fraley were replaced and publicly voiced their dismay at their treatment by Simmons and Stanley. In 2004, Kiss headlined the Rock the Nation World Tour to great acclaim, and after a few years away from the limelight, headlined a number of festivals in 2008 before releasing their first studio album for over a decade, Sonic Boom.
Sonic Boom was the first album by the Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Tommy Thayer and Eric Singer lineup. And it was quite hard. There were no outside writers.
Sonic Boom actually did really well, got to #2 in the Billboard charts, sold over 100,000 copies. Equally, Monster got to #3 in the Billboard charts, sold tens of thousands of copies, and it seemed like a real return to form for them.
As Kiss albums, they're not bad. I think the thing they did is they realised that it wasn't a good idea for them to try and be modern. It'd be really bad if they started, doing the rap interlude and all that kind of stuff. And so what they did is they just went back to very straight, hard rock.
What's really interesting about Kiss's later albums, like Sonic Boom and Monster, is just how successful they were and how much they resonated with their fan base. I mean, these are albums that released decades after they originally formed as a band, but equally as successful, and it just shows that they still have that relevance.
I think the fans definitely like them, and the critics kind of began to see, as happens if you hang around long enough, that actually, there's a certain fondness that people have for Kiss, and I think there's an unpretentiousness to those albums that won people over. To get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, 25 years have to have passed since the release of your debut album, so Kiss were eligible in '99. It wasn't until 2014 that they actually were inducted.
There's a significant amount of disdain in the wider voting panel, which is comprised of experts and musical sages and fairly prominent people who don't really want to be voting. And there were protests outside the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that Kiss weren't involved. Anyway, they got in 2014. They were introduced by Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine, and they all turned up. And, they deserve it.
Their inclusion into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame marked 40 years of music for Kiss. During that period, they had been awarded 30 gold albums, which is more than any American band in history, and with worldwide album sales exceeding 100 million, they truly are one of the best-selling rock bands of all time.
Kiss haven't always been musically consistent. When they've had their missteps, they've gone back to what they know best, to that simple, effective rock sound.
What Kiss did was they very unashamedly embraced the idea of the band as a brand.
What was genius way back in the 70s when they came up with their comic book characters, and they didn't realise just what a great idea that was, because they will never age, they will never get old.
They have probably the most recognisable and iconic outfits in the history of rock and roll music.
Owning the Kiss jacket and using the Kiss perfume and wearing your Kiss trainers, it's really easy to be a member of Kiss.
They had no compunction about teaming up with some, corporation. They had no compunction about doing VIP packages where you could spend $1,000 and shake hands with Gene Simmons. All of these things, which are actually now quite commonplace. Kiss were the pioneers of that sort of high capitalist approach to rock and roll.
God gave rock and roll to you.
Kiss's legacy, it's a mixture of musical consistency and enduring daftness.
In terms of their music, they've made some of the most influential rock and roll, glam style songs. And then in terms of their image and their brand, they've really created something that's iconic and timeless.
Save rock and roll.